Good afternoon, everyone. Michelle Quesada here, senior reporter at WPTV, along with my colleagues, Sabirah Rayford and Matt Sczesny, both reporters at WPTV as well. Welcome, guys. Thank you so much for joining. And we're talking today about the federal eviction moratorium in place by the CDC still until July 31st. Matt Sczesny has a great report coming up today talking about the landlord side of things. Sabirah, you've been working more with tenants and what issues they've been facing in Palm Beach County. So I'll let you guys first just talk about what kind of stories you are trying to work on for today. What will we see on that before we show a story that aired this morning to kind of set the scene for everyone joining us?
Absolutely. Well, Matt, do you want to kick us off with what you found with the landlords? I haven't spoken to you about this, which is really interesting.
Right.
So I'm really excited to hear that perspective of it.
Yeah, so this is definitely from the landlord's perspective we wanted to take a deep dive into, because there are two sides in these disputes and proceedings that always happen. And we wanted to know what it is that landlords are going through and what it is they're able to do right now. And of course, first of all, it was hard to find landlords willing to talk about this. They have a lot of strong opinions about it because for the most part, when the pandemic started, a lot of the moratoriums and the aid was all directed to tenants. These landlords were still left having to pay their vendors, their property taxes, their insurance. And what we found out was that a lot of the larger apartment complex landlords were able to weather this storm a little bit easier just because they have much more cash on hand. It was the smaller landlords who really struggled through this, who still had to pay their bills while the moratorium was in place. Now, there was a couple of moratoriums that were going on all at the same time, right? We had the federal one, the CDC one, the state one. The state one has now expired here in Florida, but the CDC one is still in effect. And we can talk about that. It's in effect at least through the month of July. So we did talk with some landlords who told us that they spend a lot of this time, especially this spring, over the winter and spring, working with tenants, trying to get them to make at least some partial payments, trying to work out situations where they weren't going to be evicted. Because as we found out, evictions proceedings can be costly for landlords who are already taking on a lot of costs. And so the process of taking a tenant to court and trying to evict them just added more costs. So it was to everyone's benefit to try to get tenants to pay a little bit more. We did find out, though, that evictions are actually happening.
Oh, yeah. And we'll get to that in this story. I don't want to go too deep. Sabirah, you also had to make contact with some of the tenants, and face their struggles. What did they tell you? I can imagine this is a very emotional and stressful experience for them.
Well, absolutely. And like Matt said, you see both sides of it, really. What's interesting and what he pointed out is that this isn't, a one-step process. There's a lot of details. There's a lot of procedures that have to take place before an actual eviction can happen. But I think the biggest thing is fear. So Matt mentioned that he struggled to find landlords. We struggled to find tenants willing to talk about that. A lot of people that I came in contact with felt embarrassed. They felt shamed, and they didn't want to share their stories or share what they're going through because they felt like it was their fault. Now, in some cases, when evictions happen, it can't be your fault. But this pandemic is a universal thing that we've seen. We've seen a lot of people from all different socioeconomic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, race, you name it, deal with the same issues, right? So I think when we finally did get someone who felt comfortable speaking about it, even still, and you'll see later today at 5 o'clock in my piece, she was really shy. She was very cautious of what she was talking about because she feared retaliation from her landlord. And in this specific case, which is really interesting, she lives in a mobile home. And so her sister-in-law owns the mobile home. However, she pays lot rent. So that was kind of interesting for me to find out about because she's having to still pay this lot rent, but her sister-in-law owns the home. So what would happen in that case? And you're going to find out at 5 o'clock today. So Michelle, take us there. Let's hear what you kind of found out.
Just let everybody know who's joining in. We're talking about the CDC's federal moratorium on evictions. We ran a story this morning, and Sabirah's comment about people being ashamed to ask for help is a great segue to the story that we did this morning. I want to set the scene so you all kind of understand how did we get to this point and what's next for everyone. So take a listen. legs each and wagging tails. Rocky and Rambo have been Daniel Rollins' strength the last year.
They always kept me calm through everything. They're my best friends. That's Rocky.
This year, Daniel was afraid to think what would happen to them when he was served with an eviction complaint for missed rent during the pandemic.
I lost work and everything just went down the drain from there.
To understand how more than 1,800 evictions have still been filed in Palm Beach County alone, even with the CDC's federal moratorium on evictions in place until July 31st, we have to understand how we got here, including the pre-pandemic affordable housing crisis nationwide.
For every 10 of the lowest income families, we had fewer than 4 apartments affordable and available to them. And we had nearly 10 million renter households paying at least half of their income towards rent.
President and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, Diane Yantel, says millions of families were already one financial shock away from missing rent or facing eviction. COVID-19, she says, became that financial shock. Local and state governments put their own eviction moratoriums in place in 2020, but by summer and fall, many, including Florida's, had expired.
Slowing and stopping evictions during the pandemic was essential to our country's ability to contain the pandemic.
Being a public health measure, the Trump administration, through the CDC, issued a moratorium on evictions, but it only protects tenants from non-payment evictions and doesn't stop evictions from being filed.
The order allows for landlords and courts to take all the steps in the eviction process up to physically removing somebody from their homes, which is prohibited under the order. It means that when the moratorium expires, in some places, that final act of physically removing people from their homes may happen very quickly.
Daniel's eviction was already moving through the court system, and he did something he feels many people in his position are afraid to do.
Listen, I was ashamed for a really long time and scared to ask for help. But when I came to the Lord's place, they showed me a different way.
The Lord's Place, a nonprofit organization breaking the cycle of homelessness in Palm Beach County, helped Daniel get into a new apartment. He's working again and back on his feet. But the director of homeless outreach at the Lord's Place says hundreds are calling every day looking for help.
Most of the people that are calling in now are people that have never touched the homeless system before.
Palm Beach County received $45 million for rental assistance emergency services and is issuing those funds through September. Tenants have to meet eligibility for emergency rental assistance. Daniel said he sought help to keep a roof over his head and his best friends.
Those are my buddies. I couldn't let them go nowhere.
For a long time, Daniel was worried about what he might lose, and now he's looking ahead to what he can have. Michelle Quesada, WPTV, News Channel 5.
So this story just kind of lays out the land for us, of what happened with the federal eviction moratorium. A lot of people have asked, why was the CDC involved? Well, this was a public health crisis. And in order to stop the spread of COVID-19, the goal from the Trump administration and the CDC was to keep people in their homes, to not have all these evictions taking place because the country had basically shut down. A lot of people were out of work, and evictions were definitely on the rise at the time because people couldn't make their rent payments. So there's a lot to unpack here, and we're trying to do all of that. Today we have a series that's going to run tonight at 5 and 6 on Channel 5, and we're talking about the landlord side, we're talking about the tenant side, because as Eileen McFadden, said, finally no one ever defends the landlord, and they didn't mention the landlord could very possibly have a mortgage, taxes, insurance, HOA fees, of course, and we all have bills. Even the landlords as well are dealing with this dilemma. But one thing I do want to talk about with Sabirah and Matt, and both of them have worked the tenant and landlord side, is that there's a process to this, right? I mean, even if you're a tenant and you're trying to meet the CDC eviction moratorium guidelines, you have to be able to sign a declaration, get a declaration signed to your landlord that says you cannot make payments on rent because of COVID-19. And that's very important. I don't know, either of you wanted to jump in.
Absolutely. And I'm going to jump in right there, Michelle, because I think a lot of people weren't it's almost difficult to explain because it's so simple, but yet so many people were scared to take that step, or they didn't know about it. But it's really a simple step. You really just have to get a letter, some form of letter, and you print it out and you give it to the landlord. And people were worried. They were concerned that this was not going to be enough. But in this case, and what you'll see today at 5 o'clock, is the woman we spoke with, she went to the Lord's place as well and was able to get a caseworker and helped her through those steps and just helped her better understand the process, just so she wasn't just, given a piece of paper and not really understanding her rights or what was to come after that. But once she served that paper, she said immediately the threats stopped. So you have this process that is as simple as serving a paper, but there's still so many layers to that, right? And she's still concerned, and I don't want to give too much away, but she's still concerned about what's next. And I think that's the biggest picture. That's why we're doing this today. We're here to talk about rights, and we're here to talk about the help, but also what's next here. What's going to happen after July 31st? One of the things the CDC mentioned is that this is the last one. They said that that's their intention, at least. We don't know what will happen. We have to wait and see, but the intention is that this is it. So what's next?
So, right. So, and from the landlord's perspective on this, once the tenant does sign that document to meet one of those stipulations in the CDC guidelines, that is still challengeable by the landlord. They can still take them to court because, and it's important to note, that document the tenant signs, they sign that at the risk of perjury if they are not being truthful about what they sign. And so there are some rights for landlords to proceed with that. But the landlord also has to keep in mind that there are some significant fines attached to this if they are found to be in violation of the CDC's guidelines. We're talking about fines of up to $100,000 per tenant, and then it could even go up to $250,000 if for some reason the tenant dies as a result of that eviction or process. So there's a lot of things for landlords to wade through. So what we found out in talking with a litigation attorney and with a landlord, the best course of action for a lot of landlords was to try to work with their tenants, try to find some way to get some money coming in. One landlord told us he was almost turned into a social worker the way he was trying to work with people and eventually get some rental assistance that was actually funneling into him to help him pay his bills to maintain the building.
Yeah, and I'm glad in rental assistance because I do want to bring that up. And just so everyone who's joining in on the conversation, if you have a question for Sabirah, Matt, and I on these stories on the tenant side, the landlord side, just kind of how we got here or what's next, anything like that, please feel free to type them in the comments and we'll try to get to your questions. There is rental assistance. Okay.
Michelle, I just want to point out one thing that I think what Matt said is very interesting before we get to the rental assistance and that aspect of it. And I want to say what I found out as well when Matt mentioned talking or working with the landlords and the tenants working together, or, trying to come together and not be just totally, against one another, is it seems like the people I spoke with who were paying at least half or a portion, that way, when it got down the road and they were able to get the rental assistance, which what we're about to talk about, it wasn't as bad, right? And it was easier for them to get approved for that assistance for those portions of those amounts and then help their case. So Michelle, please continue. I just want to point
and you brought up a good point, Sabirah, and the Legal Aid Society is going to be one of the experts we talk to later on today at 5:30. We're also doing another Facebook Live with actual experts in our county talking about this, and they mentioned that definitely the situations where you see that the landlords and tenants have a better relationship, that those situations and circumstances were resolved much faster than those who did not communicate, those tenants who did not express to their landlords what was going on, that they could pay a little bit at a time or what they can actually give towards rent. So I definitely want to talk about rental assistance because this is huge for both tenants and landlords. Palm Beach County alone, they had $45 million allocated for emergency rental assistance. And it's a process. We have the link on there. We can bring it up. our producer can pop it up for you. You can go ahead and apply for this rental assistance if you meet the requirements, if you lost income during COVID-19, and that's why you weren't able to make rent. Very important. You have to meet those requirements. It can't be for other reasons, or if you already had problems that you were behind rent prior to the pandemic. There's a lot more that you have to unpack there, but this is specifically to income loss due to COVID-19, non-payment of rent. You can apply for rental assistance. You can see the links on the comments right there. WPTV just posted. And so you have to meet certain requirements, but at that point you go through an application process where you can get some funds directly paid to the landlords, and the county is working with those landlords. And while that process is ongoing, the landlords have to basically sign an agreement or enter an agreement with the county that they will not try to evict you if they're getting payments or getting some sort of funds from the county on rental assistance. So that's really important to start that process. Matt, you look like you wanted to say something.
No, I was just thinking, I was looking through some of my notes here with one quote I got from a litigation attorney who said, the tenants we're seeing action against in our review of court records, with landlords proceeding with evictions, are the tenants that don't respond to any sort of communication. And more importantly, the tenant that doesn't even show up for court. And that's usually what is going on. The lines of communication get broken, and as we said, the landlords have bills to pay, they have buildings to maintain, and they're caught in this legal situation where they have to take action, and the law is the law is the way it moves. Now, he also did point out to me there are good landlords and there are bad landlords. And I think most of us who have lived in several places probably have some personal experiences with that ourselves.
Yeah. And it's important to know too that, there is Florida law on this. As a landlord, you can't force a tenant out just by shutting off utilities or changing the locks or things like this. There is a process that you have to go through Florida law, and it's like a 6-step process to evictions. And we'll be going more in depth into that later on today at 5 and 5:30 and 6 o'clock. But it's very important for the tenants, and Sabirah, you can probably elaborate on this, that you must respond to the summons complaints. You cannot just ignore those. You have to follow the protocol, because then your case is possibly not going to go the way you hope.
Michelle, I've been doing stories similar to this when it comes to, homelessness and issues even before the pandemic, and some of the resources here that the county have. The biggest thing is you have to advocate for yourself, and communication is just like any other, situation you may have come across in life. If you are not communicating, if you're not advocating for yourself, it's not going to go well. That's point blank, period. That's the first step. And the other thing I want to touch back on is the resources. So the Palm Beach County, they have rental assistance. You mentioned $45 million. Well, at last check, only $12 million of that has been allocated. Okay, so there's still a lot, millions of dollars here that they can still help with and can still be allocated for people who need it the most. So you have to take it upon yourself to look into that and look to see when those portals are open and they're accepting applications. They open and then they close, but they're going to open it again, and that process is still going on. So that's available. So it's important. What I've seen is not to just go in a hole and not to just shut down. You have to fight, and you have to make the calls, and you have to advocate for yourself, and you have to communicate.
Absolutely. And there is help out there too. The Legal Aid Society can answer your questions, and they have even been intercepting and mediating cases that have already been filed. A lot of people ask questions, if there's moratorium is in place, how can these evictions continue through the court system? Well, as you heard in the story we played just a few minutes ago, this moratorium only stops the evictions from being finalized. So it doesn't mean that it stops those evictions from being filed. They can certainly be filed, and they can continue to move through the court process. I want to bring up a comment that we saw in here, really interesting, on the landlord side of things. Josie Q. Cartland also mentioned that they don't rent to tenants long-term, that they choose to do Airbnb style rentals because you get the payment up front. I mean, Matt, do you feel like a lot of landlords might try to explore this?
I don't know. I mean, that's that can be a seasonal thing. It's not a real consistent situation, and I think people who have smaller properties may be more inclined to go the Airbnb route for the tourists and visitors, but it's not a practical thing if you have some multi-unit dwellings. I just don't see that as a realistic possibility. I mean, landlords generally do want solid, consistent tenants who are responsible, who are paying their rent, taking care of the property. I think in the end, they still seek out people like that.
Absolutely. And it depends on your location, right? I mean, if you have a great located home that you're renting out, maybe on the beach or near the water or somewhere desirable, like you might want to do Airbnb versus, year round.
Yeah, you can get a lot more on weekly rates, sure.
Absolutely. Eileen brought up a good comment too. Wasn't that what the stimulus checks were for? And I think that's a better question for the Legal Aid Society later today. Those who received stimulus checks and still were behind on rent, can the landlord prove something in court to say, well, you got a stimulus check, you couldn't allot some of that money towards rent? I don't know the answer to that. Maybe that's something that we can find out for you later on today.
Well, I want to ask Matt something, because I think this is also a chance for people here to ask us about our process. We want to be as transparent as possible on how we're finding these people we're speaking to and our experts. And we took a lot of time and made a lot of calls. So even if you don't see a certain person on camera, that doesn't mean we didn't get their story and they just didn't want to go on camera. So Matt, for you, how did you end up finding the right landlords to speak with to fit this story and to open up?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there's a lot of quick trust that has to be established with talking with landlords. But yeah, there were a few people I had talked to, both Palm Beach County and in Martin County, and then just people who knew people, and then managed to connect with someone up in Martin County who wanted to talk to us. Owned a very large, was the leading managing partner in a very large apartment complex in Martin County who talked to us. And it's funny, he just anecdotally, he told me a story about a property, another landlord in a property out of state, in another state, where and this is how bad things can get for landlords. They had tenants who were not paying because they had lost their jobs, and they had tenants who were still working, but the working tenants who had income coming in saw the people not paying and staying, so then they stopped paying their rent, and essentially it turned into a rent strike at the apartment building, and it left this one particular landlord out of state in a very dire situation of having to pay their bills. You guys also mentioned the stimulus payment. I was looking through the CDC guidelines, and receiving an economic impact payment is not considered a reportable money towards those proceedings for evictions, mainly because that money can be used to buy food too. It's right. not strictly for rent. It could go to medical expenses. It could go to food, and so therefore that's not counted towards income that would be considered going.
And we have a link to that order too. If our producer can post that in the comments, if anybody actually wants to go in and read the temporary halt on evictions order. There was another comment that was really important too, that you can evict for reasons other than non-payment of rent. And absolutely, evictions are still happening. And if it has nothing to do with the moratorium, those evictions are still going through and being finalized. I want to make sure we clear that up.
Absolutely. And Michelle, I want to ask you, it's interesting us talking about these topics and how they can be a little bit divisive. Did you find that talking with your characters and seeing their process, did you feel tension there or anything like that? Did you come across that in your report?
Yeah, and I don't know all of the ins and outs. I'll be upfront about that. On the case of the gentleman that I spoke with, I said in my story he was facing eviction this year, and I looked up his eviction, and he was definitely facing eviction from his old apartment. He claims that it was because he lost his job. He was a mechanic, and the car shop, closed for some time. He lost his job. He was down on his luck and couldn't make rent payments, and was still being evicted by his landlord. But he also mentioned that there were some other underlying issues going on there. So I definitely think that when we cover these stories, we understand that there are 2, 3, 4 sides to every story, right? In his situation, he said that he was able to get with the Lord's place to get him out of that apartment, to get him out of that situation, because he was already moving through the court system. He was afraid that he would end up homeless and be out on the street with his dogs. He didn't want to give up his dogs, as we showed in the story, how attached he is to those. And, it's definitely 2 sides to every story. And just looking at, he was facing his own struggle, but we don't know, his landlord may have also had several apartments and have to keep tabs on everybody else for those. And so it's one of those situations where we understand, and the county understands as well, that the property owners are partners of the county, right? I mean, we wouldn't have so many people that can rent if we didn't have landlords who were able to put up their apartments, their houses for rent for these tenants. So it's really a complex story. And I'll tell you, I found that gentleman through the Lord's place. And there was another family that I was supposed to talk with before him, and that fell through because at the end of the day, they backed out and they were just kind of embarrassed to even tell their story. Which, we get, we understand not everybody wants
I heard that a lot. I mean, a lot. And it's understandable. It's on both sides, and people just feel like this is personal and they don't want to talk about it. But I think when they get the opportunity to know and learn more that they're not alone, then it's like, okay, you kind of see the floodgates open up. Going back to that stimulus payment, $1,200, $600, that is not even, for some people, the cost of rent here. And, I did a series or did a couple stories a year or two ago. Who knows now? It's been like everything's a time blur. So a year and a half ago, probably before the pandemic, one paycheck away. People were living one paycheck away. This pandemic has exacerbated that. Now we're seeing the impacts of what could happen and just how fragile of a system we have here in South Florida with the high amounts of rent and low paying jobs. What about you guys? What did you guys notice in that regard?
And I'm glad you brought that up, Sabirah, because that is the reason why we're here, right? There was already a national housing crisis going on. As we saw earlier in the story, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition president was talking about how there's a large percentage of Americans who were paying more than half of their paychecks towards rent, a lot of times more than half of their income a month. And so when you look at that, you're like one step away from becoming homeless, because you're one step away from missing that rent if something goes wrong, if you lose your job, if you get sick, which we also saw a lot of people have to take a lot of time off work if they got sick with COVID-19 last year too, which also was an issue. And if you're a waitress, if you work somewhere where if you're not there, you don't get paid, that's a huge problem for you. So definitely just an overall encompassing issue that affected everybody, because there was already this crisis going on. And the takeaway here is we need to do better, right? There needs to be legislation. There needs to be something passed to make it easier for people to be able to obtain housing.
So to wrap up what I had experienced and found out, and there's a comment from Jennifer here, and I think the biggest takeaway I have from the landlord's perspective is that they felt like they were ignored. They struggled to, maybe not to the extent that a lot of people who, had to choose between food or rent, but they have a responsibility too, right? I mean, they have a responsibility to house people, multiple families, children, and do it safely, certainly under penalty of the law. And Jennifer's comment really stood out to me. She pointed out during the Charlie Francis Gene hurricanes, having to evict people at a time of crisis is very stressful. As a landlord manager, you have to be social worker and weed through the good people and the ones taking advantage of the system. And unfortunately, what's going to happen coming out, I think, out of this moratorium, we're seeing signs of it already, is that a lot of rents are going to go up because a lot of landlords took a lot of financial hits during this time. And like any other business, they're going to look to recoup some of their losses, so to speak. I'm not saying that's a uniform thing that's going to happen, or I'm making an excuse for them. I think it's just the reality. We're seeing prices go up in a lot of things nowadays because a lot of industries and sectors did suffer through the pandemic.
And there was a comment earlier. John Karpinski commented that is already happening. They're seeing people who couldn't make their rent, and their landlords were already raising their rents $500 or $1,000 more, just because of the situation going on. So that's definitely something that we're gonna see, happen. And to the point of the landlords too, Matt, and you referenced this, it's a lot of responsibility, because if you're not getting those rent payments and you're also behind on your mortgage and everything else, and something breaks down in that unit, by law, you're still responsible to fix that.
Right. Right.
So, it's a lot of responsibility, and it's a lot of struggles and stress all the way around.
And I think we're going to see a lot of nonprofits struggling. I mean, we have a lot of nonprofits that do this work full time and way before the pandemic. And now they still have that work that they were already doing and those clients on top of this with people who've never experienced being on the verge of homelessness. So you have these, there's no place to put them, frankly, is what I'm being told from a lot of nonprofits here who do the work full time all year round.
And, you know, just before we close, I want to leave you all with this. You know, the Lord's Place homeless outreach director told me they're getting hundreds of calls from families that have never touched the homeless system, that are terrified, thinking that if, you know, July 31st comes around, they may be homeless or their eviction may be finalized or they'll be faced with an eviction summons complaint. So something to think about for sure. We're going to have much more on this today at 5 and 6. Matt, Sabirah, and I have some great stories for you all that kind of really dive deep into this issue. Of course, you can also find resources online on WPTV.com. We posted links to the rental assistance programs in our counties and more information. Thank you all so much for participating. And Matt and Sabirah, thank you for all your hard work.
Good afternoon.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.